Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Dwight Eisenhower, and the focus is the next great war. The year is 1940. Ike is a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. He's 49 years old, coming back from the Philippines, ready to take on command responsibilities in charge of the battalion, the 15th Infantry, at Fort Lewis in the state of Washington. But when he gets to San Francisco, he's waylaid yet again, always in demand his services, and this time it was Lieutenant General Jake DeWitt, the commander of the 4th Army, based in San Francisco. He said, "Look, Ike, I need your help. We've got a major exercise coming up here in Northern California in the Monterey Bay area. I need you to help me plan it and execute that mission, and then you can go off to Fort Lewis." And so Eisenhower saluted, did his duty, actually enjoyed it because it was a chance to get on the ground with troops during those exercises. This is in the August timeframe of 1940, and right after that, well, Germany invades Poland. Britain and France declare war on Germany. Germany declares war right back. World War II in Europe is underway. Eyes wide open for what that meant as far as Dwight Eisenhower was concerned. "Hundreds of millions will suffer privations and starvations," he wrote. "Millions will be killed and wounded because one man, Adolf Hitler, so wills it. Power, drunk, egocentric, one of the criminally insane, the absolute ruler of 89 million people, and by his personal magnetism, which he must have, he has converted a large proportion of those millions to his insane schemes and to blind acceptance of his leadership. The Americans so far, not in the war, but already thinking preparedness just in case." So Eisenhower reports to Fort Lewis, but again, others are continuing to jockey for his services. 8th Corps is looking for a chief of staff. War Plans Division and Headquarters thinking maybe bring Eisenhower back to that. He was most interested in what George Patton's next assignment might be. Perhaps as the Corps commander for tanks, an armored regiment might be available under his command that I could run. That's the kind of work he really wanted to do. But in the meantime, he's settling into his responsibilities at Fort Lewis in Washington. Overall readiness is the responsibility of the new Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, and he's planning the largest maneuvers in the history of the U.S. Army. The 2nd Army versus the 3rd Army. 500,000 men are going to converge in the area of Louisiana. General Walter Krueger is going to be in charge of the 3rd Army, and he went directly to Marshall and said, "Look, this is a big job. I need the best we've got. I need a chief of staff and a key planner who can help me organize this thing. I want Dwight Eisenhower." And so Marshall said, okay. Ike was now going back home, as it were, to his very first base, Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. It's July of 1941. He and Mamie celebrate their 25th anniversary, and then it's straight to work. This is really the first time that Ike got some national attention because Krueger, as his chief of staff, his part of his responsibility was to brief the press during these maneuvers for a couple of times a day. And since Krueger's 3rd Army basically trounces the 2nd Army on a couple of occasions during these exercises, it's all positive for Krueger, but the press also giving Eisenhower some positive feedback as well. The leadership, General Marshall and his command structure, really paying close attention to what happened in these maneuvers. Some officers were not up to it, and they were actually moved aside. Others were going to be promoted early, including Dwight Eisenhower, who got his first star, now a brigadier general. He wrote a friend, "Things are moving so rapidly these days that I almost get dizzy trying to keep up with the parade." In the meantime, you've got Europe having, Hitler moving east, moving west, and you've also got tensions in the Far East. Japan and the United States are very much at odds, and there's a boycott going on. The Japanese decide to take action on December 7th of 1941. The surprise invasion of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The next day, FDR goes to Congress, asks for a declaration of war against Japan. A couple of days later, that is extended to Germany and Italy, and now the Americans are in this global fight of World War II. Full mobilization underway, and for General Marshall, that meant he needed to have his best commanders in the field, but also some of the best staff officers with him in headquarters. He's asking around, who should he add to his team? Well, General Krueger and also General Mark Clark basically had one name on their mind, as Clark said to Marshall, "I'll give you one name and 9 dittos, Dwight D. Eisenhower." 4 days later, Eisenhower gets the call, "Come to Washington, the boss wants to meet with you." Now, Eisenhower had met Marshall a couple of times before, always very briefly, no detailed sit-downs really until this one here in December of 1941. Wanted to focus their discussion on the Philippines, where of course Ike had supported Douglas MacArthur for all those years. MacArthur had just been recalled by President Roosevelt to take over the Army operations in the Far East and Asia Pacific region, but Marshall wanted to know Ike's opinion about what they should do with the Philippines, which were already under attack by the Japanese. Question of whether they could be saved. Well, Eisenhower says, give me a few hours, went back to his office, succinct notes came back that very day, and not only talked about the military situation, but also the broader situation in the entire region. He told Marshall the people of China, of the Philippines, of the Dutch East Indies will be watching us. They may excuse failure, but they will not excuse abandonment. Their trust and friendship are important to us. Our base must be Australia. We must start at once to expand it and to secure our communications to it. In this last, we dare not fail. We must take great risks and spend any amount of money required. Well, General Marshall was impressed by this, the holistic nature of Eisenhower's analysis. He came back very simply and said, look, I agree with you. Do your best to save him. Just like that, he had a job. The full portfolio of the Far East in the War Plans Division now rested in the hands of Dwight Eisenhower. High expectations for Eisenhower and all of his colleagues from Chief of Staff General Marshall, who told him, Eisenhower, this department is filled with able men who analyze their problems well, but always feel compelled to bring them to me for final solution. I must have assistants who will solve their own problems and tell me later what they have done. Well, Dwight Eisenhower trained his entire career for all of this. As the staff officer to the stars we talked about in the last episode, this is exactly what he was ready to do. A couple of months into the assignment, General Marshall actually reorganized the War Plans Division. He changed things around to create an Operations Division, not only as the primary planner for the U.S. Army during the war, but also as the main conduit to all the commanders in the field back to the Army Chief of Staff. He put General Eisenhower in charge of the Operations Division, promoted him to a Major General, bypassing 162 brigadiers who had more seniority, so he's quickly moving up the ranks. That job came with some perks that Mamie was pretty happy about. They got to move into great accommodations on General's Row and Fort Myer, the finest that they had ever lived in. And also Mamie loved being in Washington because it wasn't that far from West Point, where their son, John, had just enrolled. Later that month, Eisenhower got the news that his father, David, had died at the age of 79. Now, Ike was unable to attend the funeral. His responsibilities to the War Department overrode that, but he did take some time to close his door right out of reflection of his father, calling him a just man, well-liked, well-educated, a thinker. He was undemonstrative, quiet, modest, and of exemplary habits. He was an uncomplaining person in the face of adversity, and such plaudits as were accorded to him did not inflate his ego. I'm proud he was my father. My only regret is that it was always so difficult to let him know the great depth of my affection for him. Some of that, by the way, translated to Eisenhower himself, who was proud of his own son, but also had difficulty expressing any elements of intimacy with his son, John. In terms of the war strategy, President Roosevelt agreed with British Premier Winston Churchill that really Europe has to be the priority. Sure, Japan was the one that attacked the United States. They will get theirs from the American perspective, but the priority was to defeat Adolf Hitler. He was the greater threat to humanity, and so a Europe first strategy was agreed to by Roosevelt and by Churchill. So what did this mean, though, from a tactical standpoint? General Marshall, and Ike supported him, believed that they should immediately cross the English Channel, try to break through Hitler's Atlantic Wall on the borders of France, liberate France, and then move on to Germany. And the Brits said, no. No way, we're not ready. We don't have enough men, material, ships, planes, all of that. We need to get ready for a cross-channel invasion. We're not ready for it now. Well, Marshall wasn't convinced, so he went over to London to actually have this conversation face-to-face. And when he came back, he told Ike some of his concerns weren't just about the relationship with the British and the strategy, but also about the American leadership under Major General James Cheney. He wasn't really sure that this was the right team, so he sent Ike back to London to investigate. He brought Mark Clark with him, and they were frankly appalled. This was not a group that was on a war footing. These had been observers prior to Pearl Harbor. They really were kind of holding banker's hours. They were not making the adjustment. Eisenhower and Clark talked to as many people as they could in and around London. In fact, they got some help. A driver, a volunteer in Britain's Motor Transport Corps, a 33-year-old divorcee by the name of Kay Summersby. She had recently become engaged to a U.S. Army colonel by the name of Richard Arnold. She did a good job taking him around the town of London, and also they enjoyed their company. So as Ike is heading back to the United States, he tells Kay that if I'm ever back this way, I'll hope you'll drive for me again. She said, sure. Thought she would never see him again. Ike came back and did his report to General Marshall. They did have a problem over in London. Either we do not understand our own commanding General Cheney and his staff in England, or they don't understand us, is what Ike told to Marshall. And he said, look, I've got some recommendations for some changes, and let's start with Major General Joseph McNarney. He's the right person to go ahead and lead our forces over in Europe. But the problem was Marshall had already decided to make McNarney his Deputy Chief of Staff. Besides, he had somebody else in mind for the Europe mission. Dwight Eisenhower. Now, this was a big leap for Eisenhower. He had been a career staff officer with little command experience, either in garrison with troops, he didn't deploy in World War I, he never led troops in battle. He was now in command, or going to be in command, of all of the U.S. Army operations throughout all of Europe. A big leap. He got his 3rd star. He became the least experienced lieutenant general in the Army at the time, leaping past another 60 generals, major generals who had more seniority of him. He had now had 4 promotions in the last 6 years, going from lieutenant colonel to lieutenant general, with now these huge responsibilities coming up over in Europe. General Marshall was confident in part because of all those mentors that Eisenhower had, some of the cream of the crop that he had studied under and worked with in the U.S. Army. Fox Connor, George Mosely, Douglas MacArthur, John Pershing, Walter Krueger, Marshall himself. These were the top of the top, and Eisenhower had performed well, superior ratings from all of these folks. He also had the political experience, having worked with President Kazan in the Philippines to understand the interplay between the politicians, the government, and the military, which was going to be so critical in this responsibility now going over to Europe. So yes, this was a stretch for Dwight Eisenhower, but they believed he had the skills, he had the demeanor, he had the confidence to take on this role. Wrapping up his responsibilities in the United States, he ran into Major General Francis Wilby, the new superintendent at West Point. Wilby said, "How are things, Ike?" Responded, "Brother, what do you think they've done to me now? They're sending me over there to command the whole shebang." How'd that work out? That's the story for another day. That's Dwight Eisenhower and the Next Great War, from the life of Dwight Eisenhower. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.